Hey, deserving listeners, you might remember a couple of months ago, I published an interview titled Interview with a Pedophile, in which I interviewed someone who went by the name of Jay. That's not his real name. By the way, major trigger warning for this whole episode, similar to the interview with Jay. If you have triggers and PTSD and trauma, or you think you might have triggers and trauma regarding sexual abuse or abuse of children, then I would absolutely not listen to this episode and talk with your therapist first before listening, because this kind of content could harm you in very profound ways that I do not want to happen to you. So, just be careful. Anyway, so in my interview with Jay, he identifies as a NOMAP, non-offending minor attracted person, meaning that he is sexually romantically attracted to children, but is non-offending, meaning he has not offended. He has not harmed children and is trying to not harm children, but he has these inner urges, these inner feelings, inner attractions. And in that interview, it was a long interview, very interesting interview, and I learned a lot and furthered my understanding and my compassion for people who suffer from this attraction. Now, of course, there are people who have attractions to children and will commit offenses and will abuse and harm children, sometimes dozens, if not hundreds of children. And these people need to be sanctioned, and we have every reason in the world to be upset at these people and to judge these people and to shame these offenders, because it's highly traumatizing to children. But to those individuals who suffer from this attraction, they didn't choose to be attracted to children in all likelihood, seemingly, and they are doing everything they can to prevent themselves from harming children. We don't need to stigmatize them. And the broader topic is that if we are going to reduce the abuse to children, then obviously we're interested in that, right? Then we have to reduce the stigma about people being attracted to children. Just having an attraction does not mean you automatically will act on it. And if we lump all people who have those attractions into this deplorable, evil group that should be shunned and even killed. I mean, you go on the internet, there's a sizable percentage-wise, but pretty large group of people that will talk about you need to round up all pedophiles, whether they've offended or not, and they all need to be killed and murdered or tortured or something. And what we do with people who actually do offend is up for discussion. But for those people who discover, for example, at the age of 16, when their peers are suddenly starting to be attracted to other 16-year-olds and they are still attracted to 10-year-olds or younger people, for those individuals, if we had a different society that allowed for them to come forward, because for most people who later in life offend, they realized early in life that they had this attraction. And if there was a venue for them to get help and to at least learn about what's going on with them and get some support so that they won't offend, then we could reduce the offenses and we could reduce the harm that happens to children. It's pretty obvious. But in order to do that, we have to create a society that has less stigma. Stigma leads to self-shaming and internalized depression, which leads to people not reaching out. In the interview with Jay, and in the interview that I had with the specialist who works with sexual offenders in general, it's well known among experts that for a large percentage of adults who will sexually offend both to children and to other adults, for the vast majority of these individuals, if they get proper help, they will not have the impulse to commit these offenses and these traumatizing behaviors. Often there's addiction, there's attachment issues, there's mental health issues, there's loneliness and schema issues and things that can be addressed in therapy, PTSD, that will not only lead to them being able to live a life that doesn't involve a high risk of them offending, but might even completely shift their attraction. They might find that they no longer are attracted to children, or as more broadly, they no longer have urges to harm other individuals in a sexual way. Now, as a caveat to that, as a pretty big asterisk, there are individuals that are oriented towards harming others. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. There are individuals who wake up in the morning. These are what we might call sadists or sadistic psychopaths, sexual sadists. These individuals are absolutely interested in harming other people, either sexually or otherwise. And they are perhaps traumatized as well, but it's a different category of people. And you might say that these people are quote-unquote monsters. I've worked with clients like this, rarely, but I worked with a client once, and I've talked about this before, who was just obsessively and compulsively oriented. He didn't suffer from OCD. I'll talk about that actually a little later, which is very different. But anyway, he was obsessed, given his sadism, his absolute pleasure that he derived from harming other individuals sexually. It didn't matter who it was, if it was children, if it was adults. And he was very problematic, and he would be harming people all the time if he wasn't monitored literally 24/7. And that was part of my job, was to make sure that he didn't do that. And it was a difficult job. It required a lot of diligence and a lot of resources. And I think about him sometimes and just, I haven't worked with him in decades, but I hope that he, either randomly changed, which I don't think was going to happen. I mean, it could have happened, or he's in prison for the rest of his life. But even being in prison doesn't mean you're not going to sexually harm or harm other people, right? That can happen there. So, my point is that there's a very small subset of minor attracted people, or people who sexually offend, who aren't very relatable, who might not really deserve our sympathy regarding their behavior. So I just want to point that out. Now, some people will categorize those individuals as not actually minor attracted people, or not actually pedophiles. These individuals might be categorized as psychopaths and sadists who just want to abuse anyone in any old way they can manage. And sometimes they end up sexually abusing children. Sometimes they end up pushing old people down on the street. They just want to harm others. It doesn't really matter in what venue. And so we don't really want to call them pedophiles or minor attracted persons. And, it depends. And there's a Venn diagram, but I just thought I'd point that out. The other caveat I want to say here because in this episode, I'm going to be reading your emails, because at the end of that episode, I asked y'all to email in if you had any thoughts, and a lot of you emailed in, so I thought I would highlight some of those emails today in this episode. But the other caveat I want to have before moving forward is that there are some people who are sympathetic individuals, who are minor attracted persons, who have offended or have done things that aren't maybe necessarily considered crimes, but they have harmed children. And yet these people, so these people might provoke sympathy from us. We might want to reach out to them to help them because they've suffered tremendous traumas in their life. And you could even see their behavior towards children as a product of the trauma that they've been through. So we have compassion for these individuals, and yet they have also harmed children, sometimes in very profound, long-lasting ways. So I'm not bifurcating this discussion into the quote-unquote monsters that we don't have sympathy for, and then this big group of minor attracted persons who we have absolute compassion for, and there's no nuance about it. There's the good MAPs and the bad MAPs. There's a lot of nuance to this, right? And the point is that we need to reduce stigma so that people, regardless of age, but particularly younger people, before they can act on these behaviors, typically. I mean, some 16-year-olds have already acted on their abuse of children, but even then, I mean, I guess if we really reduce the stigma and raise enough awareness about this, then even 7-year-olds might come forward, and parents of 7-year-olds might identify this more readily, that kind of thing, right? So in order for us to really stop the abuse or reduce the risks, we have to have a more realistic adult conversation about the reality of minor attracted persons, which this interview that I published a couple of months ago, I was hoping would be a part of that larger movement that has been happening slowly and kind of quietly in the background on the internet over the past 25 years. So let's get to your emails. This first email, so there are a bunch of emails relating to his discussion about his relationship with his niece. If you remember the interview, Jay was talking about how toward the end of his story, meaning that an event that happened more recently in his life, he became friends with his brother, or had always been friends with his brother, and started to have really intense feelings for one of his brother's daughters. I think his brother had like 3 daughters, but he was having particular feelings for his 5-year-old niece, the youngest of his brother's daughters, and was thinking about her often. He was going over to his brother's house not only to see his brother and the family, but also to really interact and have playtime with the child, and claimed that he did not abuse the child in any way because he knew his impulses and did not want to harm her, but found himself really thinking about it a lot, and it was worrying him and it was concerning to him. So he actually told his brother while he was drunk and said, I don't know exactly what he said, but something along the lines of, there's kind of a darkness inside of me and I don't know what to do with it. And I just want you to know, because Jay felt like he could trust his brother. He felt like maybe if he told his brother that they could work on it together or something, right? A way of reaching out for help. And the brother became very upset and the family became very upset. And so they rejected him and cut off all ties with him. And he was very sad about that, not only because he's cut off from his brother and his wife and the whole family, but also from this niece that he was bonding with. So in that interview, it was an interesting, poignant moment, and a lot of people had some thoughts about that, so I thought I'd read the emails about that. All right, so this first email, anonymous listener, he says, I just listened to your interview with Jay, and his description of his relationship with his niece sounded normal to me. He loved her, he spoiled her and gave her gifts. He got a warm feeling when he found out that she cuddled with the stuffed animal he got her. He thought about her all the time, and he visited his brother just to see her. He had a strong emotional connection toward her. He would do anything for her, even die for her, as if she was his own child. He claims that he did not feel any romantic or sexual feelings toward her. He did not even want to cuddle with her. So just chiming in here, again, trigger warning. I won't necessarily mention trigger warning for the rest of the episode, but I just want to have a second trigger warning because if the first trigger warning didn't alert you, maybe now you're starting to get into the content a little bit more and you can maybe check in with your body. And even for people who don't have PTSD, it could be bothersome and provoking and harmful to you. At the very least, you just want to periodically check in with your body and make sure that you're doing okay. You can always take a break, stop listening, come back to it later, whatever. But the other thing here that I'll say is that anonymous listener, so, he's saying, I don't see what's wrong with, and there were a number of people who said this, saying, I don't understand what was so wrong about his relationship with his niece. I mean, and on one hand, absolutely. For me, people in my family, children, adults, I have people that I have more in common with, people that, like Alina, who works for the podcast. They are my brother's kid, and I've always felt close to Alina because we have a lot in common. I don't know what it is about that, but similar to that. So is there anything wrong with having someone in your family, even if it's a kid of your sibling? Is there something wrong with having a particular affinity or closeness or fondness or bond that might be a little stronger with that family member as opposed to others? No, there's nothing wrong with that. It's completely fine, right? depending, as long as there's no harm, as long as there's no coercion or bad things happening. On the other hand, though, the way Jay described his relationship with his 5-year-old niece, I'll tell you just how I was reacting when I was interviewing him. On one hand, I had that thought of like, is he going to tell me? Because, I'm listening to it real time, right? He's telling me. So then I started to bond with my niece, and I'm like, is this headed toward, and then I attacked her or harmed her or coerced her or something, abused her. And that didn't happen, so I was happy about that. But there were things in his narrative that did concern me, and I believe from my memory, I did ask him. I was like, so what were your feelings exactly? Were you in love with your niece? Did you give a vibe of sexuality or something? I can't remember what questions I was asking. And from my memory, Jay essentially was saying, no, I didn't have those kinds of feelings. But I'll tell you, in my clinical mind, there was a part of me that was thinking, well, I don't know. We'd have to know what the niece went through. We'd have to really know what happened between the two. What's the difference between having familial love and bonding the way an uncle has for a niece? Does Jay understand the difference between that family attention and bond and love and sexual romantic feelings? Does he really understand that? Can we trust him in his evaluation of that? And so, as a podcaster, I was interested in a lot of things interviewing him. And I didn't go down that road because I thought it might be a bumpy road, and also I thought it might take a lot of time. There were so many things that I wanted to ask him about that I thought, if I go down that road, it'll kind of derail. Because he was there to tell a narrative, a story that had a beginning and an end, and I didn't want to get in the way that much. So is it possible, as you're listening to it, you could hear different things as Jay was describing his relationship with his niece? Absolutely, because I did. There were parts of me that were hoping that the child didn't receive any kind of a vibe and that it wasn't headed in that direction. And there was another part of me that suspected that it might be different than the way he remembers it, right? So, I don't know. But if it's the former, if it's a relationship that didn't involve any exploitation or any kind of vibe or messages towards the niece and wasn't headed in that direction, then yeah, the relationship was on the up and up, and it was ethical, and it was non-harmful, and it was just a normal part of being in a family where two people just kind of have a special bond. It might sound kind of funny to have a special bond with a 5-year-old, but if you've ever hung out with enough kids, you know that they're, even at 5, even sometimes younger than that, you will feel, or at least I do, and I know other people do as well, kids are people, and they have vibes at that age, and they have personalities, and they have ways about them, and that meshes differently with adults, meaning that for me, when I'll just take the clients that I worked with. So in the beginning of my career, for the first 5 years or so, I would say about a third, or I don't know, maybe 20% of my clients were kids, below the age of 12, anywhere from like 4 to 12. After the first 5 years of my career, I stopped seeing kids as often, but I would still occasionally, especially if it was a family. But anyway, when you're a full-time therapist and 1 out of 5 clients are below the age of 12, and you spend an hour a week with these kids, you spend a lot of time with these individuals. And there were certain kids. Well, I'll talk about this one family I was working with, and I was working with the grandparents and the kids. The kids were adopted into the grandparents' family, and there was an older sister who was probably 12, and the brother was maybe 8 or something. And I would see the 12-year-old and the 8-year-old in my office, and we would do a lot of play and therapy, and I really felt like I bonded with the boy, with the 8-year-old boy. I really liked the 12-year-old girl as well, but I really felt like the 8-year-old boy and I had our personalities meshed somehow. And I still think about him, and this was 1997, 1996, and I can still remember him. I remember his name, and I don't remember her name, actually, off the top of my head. So he, something about his personality, something about the way we played, something about his I don't know, just his the twinkle in his eye or something. Now, I am not a minor attracted person, so there's no risk there, right? I don't have, in fact, for non-minor attracted people, I would say we are repulsed by the idea, right? You couldn't pay me enough money, right? That sort of thing. So it's not just, it's not that I'm indifferent about it. It's that it is disgustingly repulsively awful to think about, not because of the stigma only, but because it's just, I just can't imagine, So there's no risk of my affinity and my affection for this 8-year-old boy to go in that direction. So I'm free to have those feelings in a fairly uncomplicated way, unbusted up inside of myself way, if that makes sense. Anyway, so yeah, could Jay have had that kind of relationship with the 5-year-old? Yeah, absolutely. But there's this huge risk, right? Now Jay's in therapy and had been, I believe, and was talking about this. So presumably there were checks and balances to make sure that he didn't go down a road, even internally. But there was a vibe to the way Jade talked about it. There was and I think I asked him, romantic. I remember the way he talked about her was the way someone talked about having new relationship energy. It was the way someone talked about falling in love, having a crush, right? Having an intense love crush. He would go to bed at night and think about her, and he would wake up in the morning and feel alive because, he didn't say this, but it had this kind of feeling to the way he talked. He woke up in the morning and he thought, okay, how do I reach out to her? When's the next time? I'm looking forward to this weekend when I can see her again. It starts to sound romantic in nature, right? And I believe he recognized that, at least to some extent as well. And that's what led him, I believe, to disclose to his brother, because I think he was trying to get help and some, people on his side so that it would be out in the open, so that everyone would know, so that he wouldn't do anything and there wouldn't be any confusion around that. He was trying to, I think, manage his, in another world, he would get the treatment at 16, right? And there wouldn't be nearly as much stigma in our society. And he recovers, he gets attachment-oriented therapy, he gets PTSD treatment, he doesn't go down a road of drug and alcohol abuse, he isn't ostracized, he doesn't experience all those things throughout his 20s and 30s. And then he has a regular life, but he still has this remnant of his childhood or his orientation that he has a particular affinity towards children, a particular intensity around his thoughts around children. There's very, very little risk of him acting on it because he's received the treatment and recovered and all that stuff. But on average, he is very interested in children, right? You'll meet people like that. You'll meet people who are, my mom is like that. My mom loves children and children love her. Hence the fact that my mom had a in-home daycare who, worked with kids from infancy to 4 or 5 years old. In our house, we had, a dozen or so kids running around in our house. And my mom was, and still is, just the master of entertaining and corralling children. She knows exactly what to say, the voice inflection, the facial expression, the kinds of things that she talks about, the praise that she gives to engage them, to make them feel comfortable. She's not just good with children, she's good with everyone. It just happens to be that children might need a little bit more of that because they're shyer on average. But, she'll meet semi-shy adults who are in their 40s, and my mom will get them to talk and to smile and to engage and to hug. My mom's a hugger, and I'm in that direction. So in another world, Jay might have been like that, and then when he met his niece, he would have just been that really, really fun uncle. Among all the uncles, Jay was the one that was the favorite of the kids, particularly of the 5-year-old. In another world, that was possible, right? And that Jay might kind of know, oh, you know what, I'm getting a little obsessive about this 5-year-old, but he would have enough other relationships and attachments in his life that he wouldn't be pouring all of his needs into this 5-year-old, which I think was kind of happening, because of the way the whole story went and how cut off he was from society and humans and himself and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, let's go on with your email here. Anonymous listeners. So the anonymous listener starts off saying, I don't understand what was wrong with this relationship. It was just a strong niece-uncle relationship. He goes on, the way I see it, there is nothing wrong with loving your niece. There's even a TikTok trend where women, aunties, will barrel into their sisters' houses and knock them over and do cartwheels on the way to see their niece or nephew. There seems to be a stigma about men interacting with children because people will assume they are a pedophile. Just chiming in here, absolutely. So ironically, in the beginning of my career, when I worked with various different kinds of youth, this is when I was actually working with the individual who I believe was a compulsive attacker of humans in a sexual way. And he was younger than me, and I was this long-haired, grunge type guy. And so I would be walking around with various different kids and teenagers, and he would be one of them that I'd be walking around with, trying to help and monitor. And I would get looks from people. I don't know what was in their mind, but at least some of the time, I imagine, they thought I was the sexual predator because I didn't look like their dad. I didn't look like their older brothers, I guess because I'm Asian or something. And a lot of these kids were not. And so they would be looking at me like, look at that creep that's hanging out with because the other thing was when I'd hang out with these kids, I would be entertained. This is before I was a therapist. And I would be taking them to places that would entertain them, things that would get them out of the house and integrated into different areas. And the kids would obviously want to go to kid type things. They'd want to go to the arcade or the playground at a McDonald's, right? The jungle gym thing. And so I'm standing there as a young man, and I would get looks from people thinking I was the predator and this kid was the victim, when in reality it was the opposite. I mean, literally that kid, that teenager, if I wasn't aware, he would have sexually attacked me if he could get away with it. So, because he was that compulsive. So, yeah, absolutely. We have this massively just stupid, backward society when it comes to this. And I hope it's getting better, but I don't think it's that much better. In certain communities, if you hear about a man who works at a daycare or a man who is a kindergarten teacher, there is a sizable percentage of people who will, even people who think of themselves as free thinkers, as liberal-minded, feminist free thinkers, they will see him as a threat, and they will see a woman as automatically not a threat. Now, on average, men are more likely to offend than women, but that doesn't mean that women don't offend, and it certainly doesn't mean that every man is capable or likely to offend. Now, if you are a parent and you just want to protect your children and you want to vet the caretakers of your children, yeah, and might gender be part of the quote-unquote profiling, maybe, I suppose, but this idea that somehow all men are rapists and pedophiles just waiting to offend is abhorrent and oppressive and awful. As a man who has been accused of that or looked at in that way, it is it's hurtful. It is hurtful. Now, I will say that I've also been treated mostly in my career with a lot of respect, and in ways that didn't exhibit that prejudice. I sometimes marvel at the fact that for a good portion of my career, I was doing in-home therapy and with families, and on average, half of the families I was working with had the identified client as a teenage girl, and I would often want to meet with meaning that we call these people the identified client in family therapy. We might also call them the symptom bearer. These are the family members that will exhibit the most symptomatic, problematic behavior to alert the system that something is wrong, and that often will cause the family to experience problems such that a therapist will get involved, and then they're scapegoated. Anyway, point is that a lot of times that individual would be a teenage girl, and often I would want to meet with the parents alone at times. I'd want to meet the whole family, and then I would want to meet alone with the kid, and then I'd want to meet alone with the parents, and then with the whole family again, and then maybe just the kid and just the mom, or I don't know. It just depended. But when I was meeting alone with the kid, I would arrive at the house and I'd say, okay, we need a place in this house that we could talk and people can't hear what we're saying, because I want the kid to feel comfortable. And sometimes it'd be the living room and the parents would go into their bedroom or something. But some of the times it'd be a large family and they'd be like, well, why don't you go into her bedroom, because that means the rest of us can still function in this household, because we got shit to do. And some of the sessions would be 2-3 hours long, depending, not usually with the kids, but sometimes. So I would go into the teenager's room sometimes, and it was very helpful, I think, therapeutically, because one, the kid is in their environment and feel a lot more comfortable. Two, I can look around the room and get an idea of what kind of kid this is, because a lot of kids, particularly today, will express their personality and their concerns through the way that they decorate or treat their room. Also, it's a conversation starter. I see a poster or a trophy and I'll be like, oh, tell me about that. That sort of thing. So, a lot of benefits. And I don't remember a single time where it was considered a bad thing or I got a bad vibe when I would enter into a teenager's room, let alone a teenage girl's room. And so there are So I'm not saying that I was always treated that way and that all men are treated that way. Certainly, that's not the case. But anyway, I just wanted to comment a little bit about that going on. In his case, with anonymous listeners' email, in Jay's case, he does admit to having sexual attraction towards children, so I understand that he needs to be careful. But if he did not have sexual attraction to his niece, wouldn't this be a normal relationship between an uncle and his niece? I feel weird even sending this email, and I had to put a fake name because I don't want to be interpreted as defending something that is inappropriate behavior towards children. Yeah, so I've already commented on the rest of that, but that last sentence is interesting, that this man who, he identified as a man in his email. On my email form, I asked for pronouns, right? And he is saying that I not only wanted you to, call me anonymous listener, but I also, because on the form it asks for your name, he's saying I gave a different name than my real name, even though you were going to say anonymous listener, because I'm worried about my real name being associated with me even bringing this up because of the massive amounts of stigma. And that's another thing to point out that I don't know how much we went into, but some of the emailers did, which is that the stigma not only is toward the minor attracted persons, which we've already talked about, but it's also directed towards people who have nuanced perspectives about minor attracted people. So you have not only attacking of the minor attracted people, but you have the attacking of anyone who even brings up the subject without having a firm belief that they should all be thrown off a cliff. And that is oppression. That is the definition of systemic oppression. When you oppress the group, and then you oppress anyone who will defend the good ones. It's like with Nazis. Not only did they round up Jewish people and kill them, but they also rounded up and killed anyone who harbored them or defended or even questioned the notion that Jewish people should be rounded up and killed. So then what happens is everyone not only is quiet, but they will participate in the oppression of those people. And this happens it's happening in our political landscape. I could go into specifics, but that's a problem. That's when things are obviously out of control. So with this individual, he's just like, I'm just asking a question, and I feel like it's a good question, but I don't want to be, shamed and identified as a pedophile or a pedophile lover, which carries with it a tremendous amount of stigma and consequence. So I'm going to, put a different name here. Anyway, so let's go on. Well, let's take a break, get back, more emails. All right, we're back from the break. I'm going to have to go a lot faster because there were a lot of emails. So let's go faster. All right. A listener from Iowa, she says, I struggled a lot with the content of this episode, particularly when Jay described his relationship with his 5-year-old niece. I respect that Jay did his best to have a platonic relationship with his niece, but there were a few things about that situation that made me question how successful Jay was. I found it concerning that Jay homed in on the 5-year-old and didn't express interest in the older girls. I also found it concerning how he competed with her older sisters for her love and attention. That doesn't sit well with me, nor does it strike me as typical behavior for an adult. Again, I respect Jay's intentions, but I'm very concerned about that situation. End of email. Yeah, that's not how I would put it, listener from Iowa, but yeah, I think I already described that. In his description about it, it did sound concerning and wasn't necessary. I was, as I was saying earlier, I didn't necessarily take his narrative as all-encompassing of the situation. And like I said, if he were a client or if I thought there was still a risk there, because, the end of the story is that his brother completely cut him off. And so he's not in contact with the 5-year-old anymore. And if I thought otherwise, I'd be like, well, are you sure? Because the thing is that you can't depend on children to be able to speak up for themselves, right? So I'll talk about Humberto. He's talked about his childhood sexual abuse. And when he was 5, he was abused by a 12-year-old girl, babysitter. And if you ask the 12-year-old at the time, does little Humberto, do you think you're harming him? She would say no, because he wants to do these things. He initiates these things. And so, he doesn't cry. In fact, he thanks me and he says he feels special and we have a special bond, or whatever she would have said. I don't know what she would have said, but there was no indication from, Humberto's recollection is that he did not fight back. He did not say no. And he even initiated some of the things. He wanted them to happen, so to speak, behaviorally. But when we look at the whole situation, and after a lot of therapy, we know that he didn't have the ability to think along those lines, even though he was being harmed. He was being coerced, and he was getting some goodies. He was getting some good things by her giving him special attention. He felt special. He felt connected. He was abandoned by his mom, Humberto, and so he was like, this older person, this older girl, older woman. Because, when you're 5, 12-year-olds, I remember thinking, my older siblings, that's how much older they are than me, my brother and sister. I thought of them as adults. I remember when I was 5 thinking, I have my parents, and then I have my brother and sister, and they're all super old and know the world and can do anything they want, So, that's not universal, but my point is that Humberto was really desperate for that kind of attention and really appreciated it. On the other hand, he was absolutely being harmed and needed to go through a lot of therapy to recover, and is still recovering to some extent. And he had a lot of ill effects as an adult from being traumatized in that way. So when we ask Jay about his relationship with the 5-year-old, and from Jay, through his lens, we don't hear any indication that the 5-year-old is not liking the relationship. We can't depend on that as a indication that harm isn't happening, right? Now, Humberto was sexually assaulted and coerced by his babysitter. According to Jay's story, he did nothing along those lines. But that doesn't mean that there weren't vibes of things. For example, I don't know, and there wouldn't really be a way for Jay to know necessarily either, but the 5-year-old niece could have detected, wow, my uncle really, really likes me. Not only as his niece, but as something deeper than that. And as a 5-year-old, I don't have language for that, and I've never experienced anything like this before. I don't know what's happening. And it makes me feel special because Uncle Jay is giving me the best presents and is spending the most time with me. You know, 5-year-olds love to play, right? They love to, be entertained by people. And so on one hand, she's like, oh, he's giving me special attention. This is good. I'm frequently competing with my older sisters and want attention and want people to color in coloring books with me or pretend with me. And my uncle is doing that. Okay. But I'm also, again, it wouldn't be conscious thinking, but I also feel like my uncle needs me in a certain way, and that is scary to me and feels overly burdensome to me. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to take care of him, but I get a vibe that he needs me to be a certain way. And so even though I would rather not play with my uncle for that long or in that way, or maybe even not at all, I can't tell him that because I know he will suffer and I don't know what to do about that. So I'm going to suppress myself and go along with this relationship, and because I don't know what else to do. Could that have been happening as well? Absolutely. We don't know as listeners to Jay's story. There's just a lot of possibilities. And given Jay's attraction to children romantically, we can't listen to his narrative and accept it completely. Now, he has been through a lot of self-reflection, and he seems to be fairly self-aware, much more so now than he was in the past, and he's in therapy and da-da-da. But, it's just hard to know. And that's why if we could rewind the clock, I guess I hadn't really thought about this, then, well, if we could rewind the clock completely to the time he was a kid, we would help him to avoid being harmed sexually. But then if we just rewind the clock back to when he first started developing a relationship with the 5-year-old niece, we would have him be more careful about what was happening. And I also want to remind everyone that according to Jay, he was never alone with the 5-year-old. He was always with the 5-year-old amongst all the other family members, that kind of thing. So that's just another thing to point out. But that's his narrative. I don't have any reason to not believe him, but who knows? And so if we could rewind the clock, then we would want him to, we would want to monitor it more closely, I guess. It would be a lot to ask of Jay's brother. So I guess if I could rewind the clock and I could be there, then I would just really casually but pointedly observe what might result in pressure on the 5-year-old to be a certain way and to succumb to his, because it was, and this is true about all relationships that we have with kids. It's not just about their needs, right? It is kind of about our needs. Now, hopefully there's some asymmetry there in that when when we're interacting with our children or our kids or our siblings' kids or clients or students, if we're a kindergarten teacher, certainly we should be more attentive to their needs and more attuned to their needs and giving them more than they're giving us. But they give us things, right? They give us entertainment, they give us love, they give us validation, they give us entertainment. They meet our needs in terms of wanting to help younger people. There's a lot of needs that we have involved. So there's nothing wrong with Jay having needs being met, but I would want to watch to make sure that there was flexibility. Say the 5-year-old starts to give body language like she wants to move away from Jay and play in another room with her sisters or something. And I notice that Jay kind of is a little rejecting, a little sad, and the 5-year-old pulls away from that freedom and goes back to Jay. Then I would say, whoa, something's going on here. Stuff like that. And there's a myriad of things that one might observe in a situation like that, and then we would have a better idea as to whether or not harm was happening to the 5-year-old or not. But from Jay's description, it's hard to tell. All right, this next email is from listener in Iowa. She says that basically saying that Jay's relationship seemed normal, and then asks, does he feel strongly that there's a big difference from those natural familial loving feelings and his inappropriate feelings? Or is it that he is possibly unable to distinguish the difference between those feelings due to his early childhood trauma? End of email. Yeah, those are good questions, and I don't know. It would require a lot of exploration, and to truly know, you would have to do a lot of assessment with a 5-year-old. You'd have to observe the situation. It's just hard to know based on what we heard in that interview. All right, listener Sarah, she wrote in and says, I just wanted to say that the interaction with his niece was not harmless. Kids sense these things. They feel the qualitative difference in the relationship. The mix of power, vulnerability, and confusion they can feel in these emotionally charged situations can really impact their sense of safety and predictability in the world. End of email. Absolutely. Again, it's just hard to know. And I find that it's interesting, the tone of the emails that we're getting. And I didn't listen back to the interview. I'm going off my memory of it. So maybe if I listened back to that portion, I would feel differently about it. But from my memory, there were just a lot of questions. And in my experience, there are a lot of questions that require a lot of data gathering, and even after the data gathering, it's just hard to know. I mean, in some ways, specific to the situation with the niece, we might not, even if we had all the time in the world to do all the assessments that we could, and we could even get honest, real deep answers from the 5-year-old as much as a 5-year-old could manage, we might still not know the effect of Jay's relationship with his niece until the niece was an adult. And even then we might not really know, right? But sometimes these things lay dormant until people are adults or beyond. So it's just hard to know. But I find it interesting that from my perspective, someone who's worked in these areas, is that there's just a lot of questions, and it's a matter of managing risk. So like I said earlier, if we could go back in time, we can't depend on Jay, and I don't think even Jay would necessarily say that he could depend on himself to necessarily navigate that situation without imposing some risk of something happening to the 5-year-old, not necessarily of a sexual abuse nature, but along the lines of what, Sarah, you're talking about, that confusion and vulnerability and power and that pressure that a 5-year-old, or that the exploitation, the emotional exploitation that a 5-year-old might feel in that situation, that we can't necessarily depend on Jay to monitor that. So we would, given his attractions, given his tendencies, and we would want to be there to make sure that we would be able to monitor the situation and watch it, right? I guess in a different perfect world, we rewind the clock, and he's able to tell his brother and his wife, look, I have this thing, so, but I also have a strong bond with your youngest daughter, but I need help in monitoring to make sure that nothing emotionally exploitative happens to the 5-year-old. So can you watch me and just kind of tell me, and the brother and the sister or the wife of the brother have a nuanced, helpful understanding of NOMAPs, of non-offending minor attracted persons, and thus can navigate that situation such that they can monitor without stigmatizing, that kind of thing. that's not the only answer, right? There are many different things one could do. Another thing we could do if we were around the clock is just tell Jay, look, you can't bond with this 5-year-old. There's just, you can't even really even play with you have to play with the older kids, people that you are not at risk of developing those kinds of feelings for. So that's just, them's the breaks. Like we just can't take that risk. There's no reason why you have to play with the 5-year-old. You know what I mean? So that's just the way it's going to be. It's another thing that we could do, rewinding the clock, and that would be possibly the safest thing. And honestly, I guess if I were the brother, that's probably what I would do, even given my expertise. If I had a brother that came to me and said a similar thing like Jay did, I would tell him, well, thanks for telling me. And I guess I would want to talk a lot about, well, what's going on, and have you ever offended, and where are you in your treatment, and how are things going? Because for my own kid's sake and for the world's sake, I would really just want to make sure that I was reassured that the risk was as low as Jay was claiming it to be. And then I think in the end, especially if my brother told me, look, I have a real fondness for your 5-year-old in contrast to your other daughters, I would say, like, well, my 5-year-old has a lot of relationships. She doesn't need another one. So this isn't about meeting her needs. It sounds like it's about meeting your needs, which, I value. You're my brother, but I don't want to take that risk because we can't know, because we can't ask a 5-year-old how she's doing with her relationship with you. She's too young. And the risk is, it's not tremendous, but it's enough that let's just not take that risk, right? Let's just have you not do that, because let's not do that. Now, I wouldn't say, get out of my house, you disgusting monster. That's not what I would do. At least I would hope that I wouldn't do that. But anyway, I find it interesting that for a lot of people emailing in, and I'm not accusing the previous emailers this, but it seems like there's a tendency for people to make strong assumptions and conclusions based on very little information, right? The way this last email says, like, I just wanted to say the interaction with his niece was not harmless, meaning the interaction was harmful to some extent, right? We can't know that. It's hard to know. Could it be harmful? Yes, absolutely, as we've discussed. But we don't know. And then other people were emailing in and saying, I don't see the harm. There's no harm there. I don't hear any harm. And we don't know. That's the thing. And one of the reasons why we don't know is because we have so much stigma around this and around mental issues in general and around sexuality in general that we just don't even have nuanced ways of thinking about it, looking at it, monitoring it, talking about it. So we're kind of forced into this knee-jerk, black and white way of thinking about things, And, it's sort of like, this is a very different topic, but people will ask questions like, sometimes they'll ask me, do you believe aliens exist, right? And if you think about it in this very simplistic way, you can either say, no, absolutely, there's no aliens, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, you could say, absolutely, there's got to be aliens. The universe is this vast place and da-da-da-da, and we're not special. Yeah, of course there's aliens. But when you are a nerd like me for astrophysics and for these kinds of topics, Drake equation, blah, 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 you understand the answer to that question, do you believe that aliens exist? My answer to that question is extremely long-winded. There are so many things that I would have to say in response to, do I believe that intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe? It's a very long answer. I can't answer that question in a simplistic way. Similarly, when it comes to minor attracted people and topics like did harm happen or not, because of our childishness regarding this topic, because when you ask uneducated, I'm just going to say this, because as a nerd for astrophysics, a lot of people have very little understanding of astronomy and astrophysics and the possibility of intelligent life existing, which is fine. I mean, why would you know as much as I've been nerdy about it? It's the very first thing I was nerdy about. I was nerdy about it when I was 6 years old. I don't know why. I was into telescopes and stars and stuff when I was a kid, even in kindergarten. I don't know what was wrong with me. But so when I hear people talking about that topic amongst themselves, I always have a little bit of a smirk, because the kinds of ways they're responding, it's ignoring the bigger picture and how complicated and how rich that question is, and how many things play into it, not only just the facts of what we understand about the universe thus far, but also our own cultural bias about, what is intelligence, and our own ideas. Anyway, point is it's a very complicated question. And so when people bring up the question as to whether Jay was harmful to his niece or not, I see a similar kind of conversation around that, right? It seems it's very black or white. It tends to be fairly simplistic, and they're not saying wrong things, right? The people aren't being wrong about it, but there's just a lot to explore, is my point. Now, I also want to say, like, I would, I'm glad I kind of went down that road of like, well, what would I do if Jay were my brother? And I don't think I would have initially thought I would land there, but as I really embodied that scenario, I was like, you know what? I think I would have actually just said, you can't have a relationship with my 5-year-old niece. I mean, you can be in the same room with her, but you can't have you can't have a bond. That's just, it's just too much of a risk. And my 5-year-old daughter is doing okay without that. It's not like she needs that. And so it only carries with it risks. And let's just not. I don't think it's a huge risk, but it's enough of a risk that I just don't want to take that risk. I'm glad that I did that, because I don't think I would have initially thought I would have said that. Because as a clinician, I wouldn't say that, right? As a clinician, I wouldn't tell Jay's brother, this is the road you should take. I would be more, I would give all the factors, and I would say, do what you want to with this. And I wouldn't be pushing them in any particular direction. But it is kind of interesting. It's sort of like when you ask your physician, it's like, your physician, she's telling you, okay, well, we could go down this treatment route, or we could go down this treatment route. And one question that you'll hear patients ask is, well, what would you do? Or if this was your mom, what would you do for your mom? And that's a different question, right? Because the physician is just laying out the facts to the patient. But if you personalize the question to the physician, sometimes you'll get a different answer. Now, sometimes they won't be truthful with you for viable clinical, ethical reasons, but it is interesting, right? Now, I also want to say that if my brother came to me with this, I would hug him wholeheartedly and say, thank you for telling me, and I'm sorry you're going through this, and let's hang out all the time. I want you to have a good bond with me. I want you to feel like you can talk with me. There would be a lot of other things. I wouldn't just be like, no, you can't hang out with my 5-year-old. I wouldn't want to be just depriving my brother of something like that. So anyway, let's go on with another email. Listener L, she says, I just want to say your interview with Jay was so heartbreaking. It really provided insight on those who try to not harm. Though I don't 100% agree with his assessment on what should happen to active minor attracted persons, I can't help but to feel like non-offending minor attracted persons get the short end of the stick. My heart also broke with his attachment to his niece because, honestly, to me, it felt like he just had a very close uncle relationship, but because he has an attraction to children, he couldn't even fully enjoy that without feeling guilty. It didn't seem like a sick relationship at all. I really hope he gets to heal and his life improves. It sounds like he is genuinely a good person who has been abandoned left and right. When I was a young teenager, 13 to 17, I had an older cousin who took advantage of me. The harm he caused me, I couldn't even begin to put into words. Now that I'm an adult and in therapy, I've started healing from that. But I'll be honest, I really didn't think I could have so much sympathy for Jay when I first saw you post the interview. It took me a couple of days after reading the title to actually listen to the interview, but I went in listening biased. Then when I realized he was a non-offending minor attracted person and how those attachments solidified in him at such a young age, I found myself identifying with him even though I do not have the same attraction. Thank you for bringing such a nuance and compassion to such a difficult subject. End of email. Yeah, I'm glad that a lot of people had that sentiment, and since this episode's going a little long, I don't think I'm going to be able to read all the emails, and so I'll just summarize and say that a lot of people emailed in. I would say 7 out of 10 emails were saying similar things, that they came into the episode with a bias and benefited by listening to the episode because it really broadened their understanding of the topic and added this potential profile to their understanding of pedophilia and minor attracted people, that they're not all monsters and that they're not all evil people waiting in the dark corners of the world trying to abuse children. Like I said, there are people like that, by the way, and we have to be careful, but not all minor attracted people are like that. And so a lot of people were saying that it helped them to expand their knowledge and understanding. It also, a lot of people were quite moved by their, by Jay's story and how unrelentingly traumatic his life has been, how just one thing after another happened to him that was hard to, that any one of those things would destroy someone, right? Would destroy me, really. I've lived a very, very cushy, easy life. And when I hear about this kind of suffering, it just, I marvel at people's ability to survive. And Jay went through dozens of these kinds of things, right? And the ongoing suffering of not being able to enact his romantic needs, right? He is not only attracted to children romantically, but he has zero romantic attraction to adults. So he can't even engage in relationships that could approximate his needs being met. So a lot of people are emailing in talking about that and praising him for his strength and praising him for his courage for coming forward. So I want to acknowledge that. All right, let's take a break. More emails after that. All right, we're back from the break. So this next category of emails were just kind of my grab bag group. I just called it the other category. And listener Tom from Japan, he wrote in and says, "Is it concerning if I wasn't at all triggered by the interview? I listened to the whole thing and found it all quite okay. There were definitely sad and disturbing moments, but I didn't feel any need to decompress, nor did it really affect my mood or day at all. Yet, by the way you and others responded, it sounded like it deeply affects you and the others. Is there something wrong with me?" Just chiming in here. No, in short, there's something wrong with you. I think that perhaps my tone and my care to people and their triggers, and we really have to identify what trigger means. When I'm saying trigger warning, I am typically talking clinically about PTSD and trauma responses. If you don't know, for example, if someone was sexually abused as a child and they still have, to some degree, PTSD and trauma reactivity regarding that trauma. So let me describe it in full because I think it's important too. That when you have a 4-year-old who's being sexually abused, there is often an experience of terror where the child is experiencing tremendous, overwhelming fear and distress, okay, which we would imagine is absolutely possible and likely in a situation like that, if not universal. And when we go through intense experiences of terror and distress, we will possibly, not always, develop PTSD, dissociation, and other kinds of trauma reactivity, such that when you are reminded of the trauma or you think about the trauma or the memory pops up in your mind, then your physiology will go through a similar, if not the same, if not even more intense terror as you did when you originally went through the experience. So perhaps it's easier to imagine a more mundane or more, I don't know, just a different kind of scenario where you are at a bank and a bank robber walks into the bank with a gun, and say there's two bank robbers, and they are robbing the bank, and something goes a little wonky, and they start shooting people. And right next to you, someone has a major injury to their body. They're shot, and there's blood, and the person is dying, and you're laying on the ground trying to not get shot, and you're watching people get shot, and you're thinking you're next, right? Or I guess let's talk about school shootings, because that's a thing. So just map that onto a school shooting. You are going through tremendous terror, right? You are just the most intense fear you've ever experienced in your life, right? Just massive amounts of physiological, psychological fear. Everything's happening in that moment. Our brain reacts in a way that's very specific to that kind of trauma, to that kind of terror. And as a result, PTSD and other kinds of trauma reactivity can result from that one incident, or you can imagine a number of incidents happening, like child sexual abuse, that could all be traumatic, right, and add to this sense of terror. And then your body learns to try to avoid that terror, right? Fear is a indication of danger, and we evolved to try to run away from danger, right, and run towards safety. So when we're maybe years later reminded of those events, our body kicks into high gear and says, run, 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 run. And our mind doesn't necessarily know the difference between something that's actually happening to us and a memory of something that's happening. Or, for example, with the gun situation, you are in a school shooting or in a bank or something, and the bank robbers, there's all the elements that your brain has recorded from that event get recorded. And then 10 years later, you're watching a movie. There's a bank robbery taking place, and it reminds you of the bank robbery you went through. Now, consciously, you understand this is just a movie. It's not only just a movie, but it's make-believe. These are actors. There's no bullets in those guns. That blood isn't real. But most of your body and mind does not know that. Most of your body and mind can't interpret fakery and imagery and imagination. It doesn't want to take that risk. And so it believes you're going through it again. Not only is it happening to those people over there, but you are in tremendous danger. And our body's evolved a mechanism that says, don't take the risk. Experience the fear and run, run, run. Okay. So you're in the movie theater, and part of your body is wanting to run and run and run and never stop until you're back home in your bedroom under the covers. But another part of your mind is like, it's just a movie. What's happening? If I stand up and run away, if you're actually in a bank robbery and you run away, that would be rational. But you're in a movie theater, you feel ridiculous. You feel ashamed of yourself. You feel, quote unquote, weak. So what's wrong with me? Okay. So when people listen to this podcast and I'm talking about childhood sexual abuse, particularly talking with someone who's attracted to children, there's a possibility that for those people who have PTSD regarding those traumas, their body will go through that reaction, even though they know consciously they're not in danger and that they're just listening to a podcast. But their body and most of their mind does not know that. And all the consequences that happen from, and it's not just an urge to run. That's a very simplistic way. The body will have all sorts of distressing hormone dumps and neurotransmitter dumps, and there'll be a reverberation through the person's life for the next 3 weeks where, especially if they dissociate, where they enter a depressive stage for a week, and then they enter a alcoholic stage for another week, and then they enter in, it just going through that event and having that tremendous trauma being triggered can have a very harmful effect, and it can further the trauma reactivity in the individual because it's yet another traumatic moment to the body and mind, because the body and mind can't differentiate between an actual robbery and the reminding of a robbery, if that makes sense. So when I'm saying trigger warning, that's what I'm referring to, is PTSD and dissociative triggering or other kinds of trauma reactivity. And I want people to be mindful of that and to take care of themselves and to know when a potential trigger is coming up that might. So what I'm often trying to predict is if one of my listeners has PTSD about the topic I'm about to talk about, then I want to give them a trigger warning so that they can protect themselves. Okay. So when I'm saying trigger warning, that's what I'm saying. Now, in the broader, parlance of the times, and even among my own use of language, we'll use the word trigger in a broader way, right? We will use the word trigger to also refer to, for example, if you were cheated on, but it wasn't PTSD or dissociative related in terms of that difficulty and that word trauma, relational trauma. You didn't go through intense terror, but you did go through a very difficult moment where it was very hard for you because you were being cheated on by your partner. And then later on, so you went through relational trauma, and then later on, 3 years later, you're with a new partner and they stay out all night with their friends and they don't check in with you. That would be another example of what we might call triggering, where your relational traumas are being triggered, but it's not PTSD, okay? It's not dissociation. It's a broader term for trauma and a broader term for triggering. And when I'm saying trigger warning, I guess I'm also saying watch out for that, but less so, because there's not a huge likelihood that for that individual, for example, if they were traumatized by infidelity and then 3 years later they're listening to the podcast and I'm talking about infidelity, there's not a huge likelihood that they're going to be incredibly harmed by that quote unquote trigger, which is, maybe we call them like relational trauma triggers or small t triggers sometimes, small t trauma triggers, lowercase t. And maybe we need a better language around this because it's important for us to delineate between those two. Again, sometimes people will say uppercase T trauma, lowercase, but I don't know. Maybe I've never really liked that delineation, but maybe that's the best we have. Anyway, now that isn't to say that that can't be harmful, but not nearly as harmful, right? Now, some people will, I think, because they just don't want to hear something, right? You can imagine someone having gone through infidelity, or let's say racism. I think that's more likely. Someone goes through a lifetime of oppression and racism. And although they don't have PTSD from the racist comments and behavior towards them, they do have relational traumas, we might call them that, or societal traumas regarding oppression from racism, which absolutely is the case. Anyone who is the target of racism or any oppressive system has what I would frame as societal or relational or oppression traumas, whatever language we put to it. But it's not the same as PTSD. It can be, obviously, you can develop PTSD from racist behavior coming at you, but let's just say that for an individual, they don't. And then later on in life, they're listening to this podcast, and I talk about a topic of racism, right? And although I'm on the right side of the topic, meaning I'm calling out the racism and I'm, supporting and advocating for the oppressed, the listener is being quote unquote triggered, right? They are remembering their lifetime of being relationally or societally traumatized, lowercase t trauma, and it's bringing up some feelings for them. They start to get a little distressed. Maybe they cry. Maybe they're getting angry, and they're triggered, right? But that's different triggering than PTSD. In that moment, that individual, in contrast to a typical person with PTSD, this individual who's being lowercase t triggered by the racist discussion has a lot more of their facilities under control psychologically. In those moments, they can, although they're going through some level of suffering, they can extract themselves more easily. They can notice, because that's the other thing about PTSD and dissociation is like when you get triggered, you might not even know you're triggered because certain aspects of your consciousness get shut down or compromised such that you're in a full-blown episode of capital T trauma being triggered, but you don't even notice it, or you don't even know that you are allowed to pull yourself out of it and stop listening to the podcast, Whereas the second situation, it's much more likely that you'll still have those faculties available to you. Not that you aren't still suffering, but it's a different kind of a triggering process. So, Tom, in Japan, you're like, is it weird that I'm not triggered by this? Okay. So one, no, it's not weird. And so as I was talking in, the Jay interview, I was really sure to lay it on thick that everyone needs to take care of themselves. Because I feel like if I don't do that, people, I could have just at the beginning of that episode said like, trigger warning, da-da-da, and just never talked about it again. But as a therapist, I know better than that, that people need check-ins. And that even if you don't, because I was saying in the trigger warning, I was like, even if you don't have PTSD and you're not typically triggered by this, you could still be massively triggered by this, which is also true. But in all those discussions, I don't think I ever said, it's also okay if you don't, because by implication, I could be giving this message that there's something wrong with you if you don't get triggered by it. And I definitely don't want to put that out there because, yeah. Now, I will say that there are a lot of people who have different compassion triggers, I guess we could say, different things that will provoke their compassion. Some people are just extremely sensitive and just very compassionate towards others. And so if they hear any kind of suffering, they will feel it, right? They're not suffering, but they just feel, I just feel so bad for all these people. I can really have the empathy for people who are going through this, for both the victims and, for that. So it's a personality difference, but it also could be, so it could just be that, so the question you want to ask yourself, Tom, that I would ask yourself if I were you is it just that I just wasn't triggered because it's just not really triggering to me? It just, it was disturbing, as you say, there are definitely sad moments and disturbing moments, but it didn't really affect me deeply, and I wasn't terrified by it. Maybe I'm used to those kinds of conversations. So on one hand, it could just be a normal, non-triggering reaction, but there's another possibility that you might be actually cut off from your feelings in general, and your feelings are happening down there, but you're not noticing them. Because I think it would be hard past a certain developmental phase of maturity to listen to that interview with Jay and not have something happen in your body. I have a similar lecture and discussion area with novice therapists, because I'll ask them, so what's your countertransference with this client? And I would say most of the time when I ask novice therapists that question, or even experienced therapists, but less likely so, most therapists will say something like, oh, nothing. They don't remind me of my parents at all. So yeah, I don't have any countertransference. And then I say, well, let me define countertransference. How I use it in supervision and in training is it's a very, very broad definition that includes any and all reactivity emotionally that you have in any and all moments with the client and whenever you're thinking about the client. So according to that definition, and there are many different definitions of countertransference, which I've gone into in some deep dives before, and they're all valid, so you just have to kind of figure out what definition you're operating from. But my point is that we're always having an emotional vibe, an emotional reaction with our clients at all times. People, especially, in America, the United States, we have this idea that you have, like when people cry, they're like, oh, I'm being emotional right now. And I'm like, you're not that's not the definition of emotion. Crying is not the definition of emotion. You're always having an emotion. You're always having an emotion. We are emotional creatures. You cannot not be having an emotion. You're always feeling something, okay? And sometimes we have to broaden our definition of emotion. Sometimes just any kind of psychological experience we might call, like pain sometimes isn't, physical pain isn't necessarily included as emotion, but I do include that, right? Anyway, so as a therapist, particularly when you're talking about some intense things, you're always having some feeling that's happening. A lot of it's out of your awareness, but paying attention to that occasionally is important. And so to say that you're only quote unquote emotional when you're crying is extremely narrow understanding. It'd be like saying you only breathe when you're running or something, right? You're always breathing, okay? You're breathing unless something very horrible is happening or you're purposely holding your breath or something. You're always breathing. You're just not aware of it, right? And so you want to potentially pay attention to that. You want to potentially occasionally pay attention to your emotions. And so it's hard for people to identify that. And even for therapists who are presumably more emotionally accepting and aware than the average person, but even them, because my trainees are often raised in American society, they have almost no awareness, or I will say they have a lot of growing to do in terms of their awareness of their emotions, as I did for myself. I was pretty classic in that way when I started out. In the same way, for you, Tom, it's possible that as you were listening to the Jay interview, I don't know, possible that you were having a lot of things happening for you, but you weren't exactly connected to it. Having said that, even after all that investigation, if you are fairly confident that you're in touch with your body and your emotions and you weren't triggered and didn't have an intense emotional reaction, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with you at all. Even if, generally speaking, you had very little emotional reactivity, it's not a disorder. It's not a problem unless it is a problem. Okay, my goodness, I'm yammering so much today. I think I'm just in a kind of a talkative, good mood, I guess. I don't know. All right, Tom goes on to say, I'll also mention that I have been triggered by some past Psychology in Seattle episodes, often when you say something I disagree with. I listened to all of your episodes on 2 times speed, but just chiming in here, I do as well. When I listen back to my episodes, I listen back on 2 times speed. When I first discovered the increased speed option in my podcast app, I increased, I was talking to a student about, 3 or 4 years ago, and she mentioned that when she listens to the podcast, she listens at faster speed. And she's a great student. She's a really nice, wonderful person, a very kind person, but she said basically that I talk very slow and that sometimes it's annoying to her, and so she needs to listen to me on a faster speed, which I completely understand, particularly now that I listen back to these episodes. So at first I started listening back at like 1.2 speed to a lot of podcasts, and not every podcast I can, if someone's a fast talker, I can't increase the speed because it's already going pretty fast, but most people talk slow, especially if they're talking off the top of their head like I often am. But so at first I could handle 1.2, and then as I got used to that, I was like, oh, maybe I can handle 1.5, and I'm like, whoa, 1.5, I used to not be able to handle. And I've slowly gotten to this point where some podcasts, including my own, when I listen to it, I can listen at 2 times speed, which is just kind of funny. My wife, Stacy, when she hears me, because she's not used to doing that, she's like, how do you process that? I think your brain just gets used to listening very quickly. But anyway, so if you don't know as a listener of that option, I would start to do that, because you can listen. For me, I'm always think about all the podcasts and books on tape I can listen to more if I get through them faster, Now, there are some podcasts that even though I could listen at faster speed, I don't, because especially comedy podcasts, because a lot of comedy depends on timing. And if you speed it up, it loses the comedic value. So there are a lot of podcasts that are that way that I can't listen to. But if it's more information-based, kind of like this podcast, but I can imagine like if it was Bob and me, if it's more emotional and more I don't know, along those lines, that it might lose its meaning if you listen really quickly. Anyway, so you say, Tom, that you get triggered by me and that you listen on 2 times speed. And then you go on, when something does trigger me, I find it's more triggering when it's on this increased speed. One way I often deal with being triggered in these scenarios is to pause, rewind, and listen again at normal speed, pausing often and thinking about what is being said more deeply. Then, if I disagree strongly, I will write an email or comment stating my disagreement. End of email. It's interesting. Yeah, I could see that happening. You're listening at faster speed. The subtleties of our communication on this podcast is sort of lost when you listen at fast speed, and then you get triggered. You're like, oh, and you take the time. Tom, you're like, well, I'll give him a second chance. We'll rewind, and I'll listen at normal speed, and then I will, as I'm being triggered, I'll stop the podcast, pause it, and think, okay, what's going on with me? Is it him? Is it me? What do I do here? And I think by conclusion, sorry, I just dropped something. By conclusion, you're saying that sometimes you conclude it's you, that you're like, oh, you know what? I think that's more on me, or maybe I'm reading into it too much. But then sometimes you do say, well, no, I think that's him. I think Kirk is wrong and bothersome in this moment, so I'll email in, da-da-da. That sounds like a very responsible, methodical way of dealing with situations like that, which I find to be very comforting to me, because it's one, I talk about a lot of things, and I would just hope that people would take care of themselves, one, but also give me kind of the benefit of the doubt. But if after processing it and you still are like, nope, I think Kirk is wrong, or he needs to be told something, then you've concluded that you've taken the time, you know what I mean? And then you can probably even tell me in a more elaborate, helpful way, because, you've given a lot of thought, which, absolutely. All right, let's go on to some more emails. All right, so this next email is potentially extra triggering. So if you're on the fence, I would fast forward 10 minutes. Listener Rosen, she says, once I sort of dated a guy online, and upon telling him about my traumas as a heads up, he basically said he fantasized about me being abused as a child, and he got off on it, about me being 7 and being molested by people and boys my age. He later told me how he was actually a repeat rape victim as a child by a teacher. This guy then told me that your vibe attracts your tribe. So that's in quotes. Your vibe attracts your tribe. I wonder if that's a saying. And he wanted to call a bunch of his friends, beat me up, piss on me, and then if I survived, that he would be grateful and spoil me. Safe to say, I stayed away from this person. End of email. Yeah. So, all right, let's look at this. Rosen, you're saying that you were molested when you were 7, and you tell a guy online as a heads up, by the way, I was traumatized. And he basically says afterwards, I fantasize about that and I get off on it. And then he says that he told you that he wanted to get a bunch of his friends together and basically gang harm you. And then he says your vibe attracts your tribe, meaning that because I think what he's saying, I don't know if he's saying it about him or you or both, but I think what he was saying was to you, Rosen, he's saying you have a vibe of a victim, and thus you've attracted your tribe, which you've attracted me because I am a victimizer. I think that's what he's saying. So on one hand, and I've talked about this before, that is true, that if you are a victim of childhood sexual abuse or any kind of sexual trauma, you might marvel at how many victimizers you've come across in your life. Whereas you might have friends that were never traumatized and they don't seem to know anyone or particularly dated anyone who was an offender or a perpetrator or a victimizer. And you're like, what is it about me? How come I keep attracting these people? Or how do I choose these? I'm on Tinder. How do I, it's complicated. And on one hand, it's kind of true potentially, and not always, of course, but anyway, so that can happen. It's not universal, but we have to be careful because we don't want to blame victims further, right? We don't want to say, for you, Rosen, for example, that you caught because of your quote unquote vibe, whatever that is, you're at fault for attracting these people. Another way to look at it, the way that I look at it, is that when people who have syndromes from this kind of trauma, victimizers, perpetrators, they're walking around the world looking for someone to harm, right? They're trying to find a victim, someone who's easily victimized, someone who is also not going to say anything afterwards, that kind of thing. And they don't necessarily care who that person is. They just want an easy victim. Well, over time, they either inadvertently or advertently figured out that people who have been previously traumatized will often succumb to trauma and will also stay quiet about it. And so they're the ones looking for you. You're not attracting them, meaning that you're not the active one that's trying to find them. They're the one who are actively trying to find you, in all likelihood. So that's blaming them, not you. Even if you held a giant sign above your head that says, "I'm an easy victim," which would be ridiculous, but that still does not mean you're responsible when someone perpetrates against you. And you could argue that this online exchange with this person was a perpetration. I mean, that's pretty awful. If I heard someone say that to me when I was dating them, that would terrify me. That would keep me up at night, just knowing that person knew who I was, or was having those thoughts. I mean, talking about getting friends together. Has he already talked to his friends? Like that would terrify me. That would absolutely chill me to the bone. I mean, that would really just, I'm disturbed being at this distance from it, Rosen. So there's that. But in the end, you stayed away from that person, which is great. I'm happy the email ended that way. I'm sorry that you went through that. And of course, I hope that you're in therapy. Usually my listeners are. So I hope that you're in therapy with someone that understands this and can help you recover and can help you to advocate for yourself and help to protect you. I hope you have a social group around you, a support system that can protect you. And that's an important thing to have, actually. I have clients, but I also have friends. I have one friend in particular who was sexually abused as a child. And although she's been through 35 years of therapy, she still is potentially triggered by perpetrators who will approach her. And they do approach her often. And when they do, she will go into a freeze mode. We got fight or flight, freeze, appease, or faint. And she goes into the freeze, appease mode, which means that a side of her kicks in that's completely out of her control that will try to appease the perpetrator and will put her at tremendous risk of being harmed again. And that's happened a number of times in her adult life. And then she goes to therapy. She knows that about herself, and it's not something that is manageable on her own. So she needs to have people around her who know the signs of that and know this very well so that they can pull her out of those situations. One time this was years ago, I was with her and a fella approached her, and from a distance, it looked like they were mildly flirting with each other. But I knew that she had this this potential trigger and this freeze appease mode. And so I normally would not want to, chicken block, if you will, male chicken block. I didn't want to do that. But with her, I know that I need to take that risk in order to protect her. And so I went over there and just kind of was like, hey, what's going on? And then it didn't feel right to me. And so I said, hey, come with me. And so I separated them, and then I asked her, and then eventually she was able to pull out of the freeze appease mode hours later and tell me, yeah, I was being triggered in that moment. I don't know if he was a perpetrator, but he was coming at me in a very perpetrator-like way, and thank you for pulling me out of that. So you need the whole system: therapy, self-awareness, recovery, support system, risk management, right? Like with her, another thing that she does is that when she's going to a social situation where she thinks there might be a perpetrator there, then like if she's going to, like in Seattle, we have an erotic art festival, and she likes to go to that, but she knows that there's a chance that, not that perpetrators go to this necessarily, but sexual discussions might be more overt in that social environment. And so she knows that she has to be careful about putting systems in place to protect her from being triggered and freezing and appeasing. And so going with people that know her well, that don't leave her side, that kind of thing. Watch her drink, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, let's go on with more emails. Okay, so I'm just kind of scanning the emails here, looking for the most relevant ones, because this is taking a long time. I think a reason why I'm yammering so much is it's been a while since I've done solo episodes, and I like it. I miss it. Not that I don't love working with the co-hosts. I prefer it, honestly. I've always preferred doing co-host episodes since the beginning, 14 plus years ago. But there's a part of me that, likes full control of the microphone where I can just yammer and yammer. Okay. So this next section is about sort of clinical issues. Just a few emails. Anonymous listener, she says, I was abused as a child, so I am almost surprised how little this interview triggered me. But I started to wonder, is it unusual for children to be sexually attracted to each other? I was attracted to other girls when I was a child, and I acted on it. Now, as an adult, I have finally realized that I am lesbian. But is it unusual for kids to be sexual together? Will children who have not been abused be sexual together? Maybe you could talk about what is normal. End of email. Yeah. So again, similar to what I was saying earlier in terms of our childishness regarding sexuality and sexual abuse, we have a very simplistic way, very black and white way of looking at this topic of childhood sexuality. And I don't have time, obviously, to go into all the nuances, and I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I have a certain expertise with it. And so what do I say? So you ask, so you're saying for yourself, anonymous listener, that when you were a girl, a child, you were attracted to other girls. I don't know what that means in terms of attraction, romance, sexual, hard to know. And you say you acted on it, meaning that you pursued sexually and or romantically girls your age. And you're like, well, wait, am I a pedophile, or is there something wrong with me? How normal is it for people, But you're also saying, anonymous listener, that you were abused as a child. So you're just like, so you're wondering, well, was my behavior towards girls my age a product of the sexual abuse I went through, and thus it's pathological? Or was my romantic and sexual attraction to other girls just an early manifestation of my normal attraction to women? And it's not pathological. In fact, it's beautiful and wonderful to me. How do I see it? Now, if you ask society, you will get very, very black and white, dichotomous answers to that. Given what you've said, and of course, to really fully evaluate it, we'd have to ask you a lot of questions like, how young? Was anyone harmed? Do you know if the other people weren't harmed by it? Were you harmed by it? Are you old enough and have gone through enough recovery yourself to even evaluate those questions? How much harm happened? It's just hard to know. And so that's one angle. But absolutely, child sexuality is absolutely normal in general. just because you have children who are what we might call exploring. Sometimes I don't like that word because, anyway, when children are enacting their sexual selves, it absolutely can be normal. It can be harmful. Normal behavior can also be harmful, is the thing. Like, there's not a line, there's not this distinct line. We can't hear a story or see a behavior, but, sexually wise in a child, and know automatically if it's a problem or not, because harm can be happening even from quote unquote normal seeming behavior. Also, on the flip side, abnormal, inappropriate behavior doesn't necessarily harm people, including children. So, and what do we categorize as harm, and how do we know harm? Because, as I was saying earlier, sometimes the harm doesn't rear its ugly head until you're an adult. So how do we know? It's hard to say. And if we suppress all sexuality in children, trying to reduce the risk of any kind of harm happening, does that also create some kind of a harm? Because you're denying children the normal exploration that they deserve. It's a complicated question, and it's case by case. It depends, right? Hard to know. What I do know is that when we open up conversations, we can monitor it. So if we have a family that doesn't have very much stigma around this whole topic, then children feel better able to come forward and tell their parents, something happened at school the other day and I don't know if I liked it or not. Okay. Then you can engage in a conversation. You can teach the child how to evaluate whether or not something was okay for them and how they want to advocate for their boundaries. You can also teach them that normal exploration, non-exploitative behavior, non-coercive behavior, if that's what you want to do, in all likelihood is okay. But if you over-engage in it, you might be creating kind of a pattern, right? I can't imagine this happening, but if you have a kid who wants to look at or fantasize about a particular thing and play with their genitals 3 hours a day, and there's no one that's being harmed, right? And the child doesn't seem to be being harmed by it, I guess. Do we want to encourage or quote unquote allow something to happen just because there's no identifiable harm? No, not necessarily. It's complicated. So there's a lot of things to talk about, but we often engage in these kinds of questions like, was that behavior abuse, or was that behavior bad or pathological? Again, to repeat myself, the question we should be asking ourselves is, how do we set up, or have we set up a scenario such that everyone has the freedom to be themselves while also reaching out for support when they have questions and when they have concerns? That's what we should be doing. And that's complicated, right? And it's hard to do in today's society. I would say it's virtually impossible to do even 50% in our current landscape and our current society, because unless you live on a commune and you're cut off from society, your kid goes to school, your kid has friends, your kid's on the internet, you're on the internet, you have to talk to other parents, you have to talk, the criminal justice system is involved, the authorities, CPS, our society is so backwards and simplistic and childish when it comes to this. You have to figure out a balance there. Not to say that parents don't strike a good balance. They do. And I worked with a lot of families like this where there was basically, you could say there's a sex positivity that is age appropriate for the children and teenagers in that family. There is appropriate levels of freedom and openness to talk about these things, not from the parents to the children. The parents didn't confide in the children about their sexual lives, but there was a modeling and a openness and a freedom, and the children were raised in that. They knew about the outside culture and were affected by it, but they felt in the family like if they wanted to go to their mom and say, a kid at school did this thing to me and I didn't like it, the kid knows that they could do that, and they know that the mom won't underreact or overreact or punish them or something. That's another part of this is like, on one hand, we'll hear about stories where children will come forward and will not be believed. And obviously that is horrific, right? And that's I think that it's hard to know, but anecdotally, that's the majority of what happens, is that they won't be believed, or they'll be blamed, or they'll be punished themselves, or something like that. There's a lot of reasons why that happens. Victim blaming, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, you will find that people will say, well, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to really, really react. And I'm going to, call the police, and I'm going to go to the school, and I'm going to protect my kid because I'm going to always believe my kid. All right, putting aside the issue of believing your kid, but sometimes if you give a vibe of overreactivity, that will also suppress your child coming forward because they're worried you're going to do something beyond what they wanted you to do. And this is common to all scenarios. If you have a spouse that tells you that they were abused growing up, or a friend, or you're a therapist and someone approaches you, it's important to not re-abuse the victim by doing something beyond what they want you to do in terms of quote unquote protecting them. You know what I'm saying? So the very first phase, if someone comes forward, is to validate, listen, and ask them, what do you want me to do? Because I want to protect you, and I want to call the school and da-da-da, but I don't want to do anything that you don't want me to do. And this was my approach as a therapist as well. It took me a while to kind of get to this place, but I, particularly because I was an idealistic person, a naive person when I started as a therapist at the age of 26, and believed that the system helped people and victims. And I learned rather quickly that it didn't necessarily. And so when people came to me with their victim stories and their victimization status currently, someone comes to me and say, I'm being abused by my father sexually. When I was more naive, I'd be like, let's get the system to protect you. And then the system would completely fail them. And I was like, oh. So then after that, victims would come to me, and I would say, I'd validate, and there'd be crying and a lot of intensity around that. And then I would say, okay, what do you want me to do? Because I'm here to do whatever you want me to do. There are some things I have to do, like I might have to call CPS or whatever, but how do you want me to do that? How do you want me to write this in my notes? You're in full control, because I don't want you to be victimized by me in terms of my reaction to your telling me that you were victimized. And I want you to know everything that I know, which is that the system might help you, but it might not. And I'll be with you every step of the way as long as you're my client. But you need to know what I know, which is the reality of the situation. I want you to be an informed person as you go through. Anyway, so anyway, anonymous listener, you're asking, is it unusual for kids to be sexual together? No, but depends. What's happening? What's the vibe? Blah blah blah. And anonymous listener, one of the things you can do if you care to is to go to those childhood friends that you were sexual with and just ask them, did you feel harmed by me? Did you feel coerced by me? That is a scary ass conversation to have, right? But if we are truly interested, and I think moral people, I think that's something that you could, ask. It depends, of course, but that's what I'll say. All right, well, let's end it there, and I'll do another episode responding to the rest of the emails, because this is going longer than I thought it would, which always happens, but there you are. So that does it for that episode. Tune in next time when I continue reading the emails in response to the interview with Jay. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, really, because you deserve it. You really, really do.